Hi everyone, it's CS Professor Pam with Jumpstart Code, and we are still working through our lessons on CSS. We are working through the material in internetingisHard.com. We are on the CSS box model lesson. We have talked about the components of a box model, which consists of the content of your element, padding that you can configure space around the content, a border that you can configure if you want to around that, and margin that can be configured outside of your element. We are at the last section of this lesson, which is talking about just generic boxes. So in the previous lesson, we added a div element, and we hadn't talked about those before. A div element and a span element are sort of generic box elements. They're both containers. They don't have any semantic meaning about your structure, but they allow you sometimes to do some useful things in terms of styling. And the main difference between div and span is that a div element is a block level element, which we've learned means they always want to start on their own whole section, right? And a span element is an inline element. And so it can be nested inside of a block element. All right, so we are going to add a button to this page. Now, I will tell you there actually is a button element, and so you don't typically use a div to do this, but for the purpose of just demonstrating a few things, we are going to use a div to do this. So I am going to copy this div element and go to my HTML and put that at the bottom of my page, right? All right, now, as it is right now, if I do nothing else, let's just see what happens. If I save, no styling. So you can see down here, there is just this text that says button that has no kind of styling associated with it. All right, we are going to do a few things in terms of styling this. So we're going to add this styling. Let me copy it, and then I'm going to talk through what all these different things are. As a matter of fact, let's do them one at a time, because it is really useful to see the effect sort of step by step of what different things do. So we're adding styling to our div, and make sure when you do this, remember we had added kind of an empty div between those paragraphs, so make sure that's missing. You see here, I'm going to take this out. So all I have in my HTML page is the heading, 2 paragraphs, and this div at the bottom. All right, so we're going to apply some styling to this div, and I'm going to do it one step at a time so that we can see the effect. So the first thing that we're going to do is apply a color to this div. So let's add this color property. Let's put this up so we can see what happens. I'm going to save all, and what happened to it? It disappeared. Well, the color FFF is white, so, and that is text color, right? If we're using the color property, it's text color, so it seems to be gone. But look, the text is actually still there, but I want to do that to show you guys that you've got to make sure sometimes certain things need to be done together. So let's change the background color of the button as well, because if I'm going to have white text, then I need a darker background color, right? So let's save that. Now we see this blue bar down here at the bottom. Okay, well, we want to style this to look a little bit more like a button. So I'm going to make the font a little heavier. So if we change the font weight to bold, now you see there, we can see the effect that happened when we made this font bold. Let's also add some padding around it. Remember, padding is going to give me some separation inside of this content. So the text will sort of look a lot nicer. So let's add some padding. We're going to put 20 pixels around all the sides. So let's save that. And you see what a difference that made? Now it's looking a little more like a button. Let's make the text center aligned. So we'll add that. Now it's looking a lot more like a button. We're going to put a border around it, and we're going to add something called a border radius. So if you want to sort of have that rounded edge to your border, this is a new property. So remember, we talked about borders, that a border has what size do you want it? Do you want it solid, dashed, dotted, and what color you want it? And let me just leave this out for a second so we'll see the difference. We'll see the effect. So let's save this. So now we have a border, but you see we have a border that is a box with the box corners. If I want to sort of soften those corners a little bit, then I add a border radius of 5 pixels, or depending on how rounded you want it, you change that number. And you see now we have something that looks like a nice button at the bottom of the page, right? But notice it took a number of attributes that we had to set in order to get this final result of what we wanted. Okay, so we get this big blue button at the bottom. All right, so again, the difference between a div and a span, the div is block level content, span is inline. Now, we've been letting our elements define their dimensions basically based on how much content is there. So, for example, we have this M element, and you'll notice, let's go over here, if I were to add just some extra content inside of this EM, then you'll notice it expands to fit whatever content is in there, right? Let me take this out. All right, because it's really important to understand how the size of things is determined. Sometimes we want an explicit width or dimension, a sidebar that's a certain size. So we have properties of width and height that we can use to override the defaults. So if I want to make this button a certain size, I can make it 200 pixels, for example. So let's go into the CSS here and make the width 200 pixels. We save everything, and we see the size of this button, right? Just as an extra little thing, you can also make this, so you'll notice this size is going to be the same, 200 pixels, no matter what the size of this page is. But remember, we also have percentages. And so if I wanted to make this 50%, for example, then now you can see let me pull this whole window over, and I'm going to get rid of this. Now, here's my entire window. So you can see that the size of my button is, now it doesn't look exactly 50%, and you're going to find in a few minutes why that is, but it's roughly about 50% of this size, right? But let's take it back to what the lesson is telling us to do, which is 200 pixels. All right. So we've got 200 pixels, and it is on the left side of the page. And notice also, if I were to add extra content into this button, if my text takes up more than 200 pixels of space, then I think I didn't save all. Right? So let me put a little bit more because I want you to see what will happen. If I just copy this and put a whole lot of button. Right? Then the content will wrap around, right? All right, so let me actually take a quick look at what I've got here. I've got a width of 200 pixels, right? All right, now let's talk about and there's some ways that we can change that. Let's talk about these actual sizes, okay? So let me take my code back to, so we've got 200 pixels. We're gonna just have button in here. So I've got 200 pixels. I've got a border of 2 pixels. I have padding of 20 pixels, right? So let's go look at this page and inspect this page. Remember, right click, go to inspect. We need to be on computed here. And here we're on elements. If I go down here, if I click here to select this button, you'll notice that the size of this button is actually 200, and then we've got 20 on each side, and then we've got 2 on the side for our radius, for our border. So it's really 244, right? If I go here and look at the actual size here, it's 200 for the button itself, but the padding and the border are not considered. So when I set the width of 200, that width was only applying to the actual content. So that's why the actual size here is not what I might think, right? So that can be a little frustrating sometimes. This actual width is not what I think it is. So the way to change that is there's a property called box sizing, and the default is a value called content box, which means the size that you give it only applies to the content. But if I change it to border box, then that means the size that I give it applies to everything from the border all the way out to the border, right? So let's look at the difference that this is going to give. So here is my page, right? I'm going to move it over a little bit here. Let's save all. And if we inspect this now, look at what I'm seeing on this button. The content inside is 156 wide. So that's 156, 158, 160, 180, 200. So the full size of this button is now 200 pixels. That's all the way out to the border. Okay? And now, for example, if I change this to 50%, then it will actually look like it is roughly half the size of my page, right? Let me get back to my page here. So here, now you can see that the width of this button, as I change the size here, is 50% of the page. So using border box is really a useful thing so that you can really control the sizing, and it allows you to be more consistent in setting up things like that. All right. Now, aligning boxes is yet another story, and let's do just a little bit on aligning boxes here. So let's add a rule to our body. So it's going to affect everything in the body. And we're going to say text align center. All right, so here's what we have right now. All right, so let's see what happened. So all of my text in here is now centered, but it did not affect this button at the bottom. So if I want to horizontally align block level elements, then we've got a few ways to do this. Auto margin is one of the easier ways to do it. And then in future lessons, we'll get into something called floats and flexbox. But for right now, if I want to align the button, then I can assign a margin. And remember, margin is outside of the content. And if I do, so this is saying top and bottom, I want 20 pixels of margin. And left and right, I'm saying auto, which means figure out how to sort of evenly space the margin on either side, left and right. Right? And look, now my button is aligned because it's got an even amount of margin on the left and the right. So that's one of the easiest ways to do that sort of alignment with block level elements. Okay, now the last little thing we want to talk about really quickly, if we notice again on our page, you see there's a little bit of white space on either side of this page. And what that is a default margin that this page has. So different browsers have different default margins. So what we usually want to do is override this. So here is a rule that you typically want to put at the top of your page always. So here at the very, very top of my CSS. Now, when I use the asterisk here, I'm saying that this rule applies to everything on this page. And what I'm doing is giving a starting value basically of 0 margin, 0 padding, and we're going to use box sizing of border box for everything, right? So here's my page here. Let's save and see what happens when we do this. And now you see there is no margin here on the left, right, top, bottom. So that is usually sort of the default behavior that you want to start with. All right. All right. So we've learned that everything, all your elements want to act like a box, basically. These boxes can be inline or block level, and you get to control the content, the padding, the borders, and the margins. All right, so in the future, we will learn a lot more about how to control the layout. There's a lot of details in terms of how to do that, but for right now, just keep playing around. That is the only way that you get comfortable with doing this. Just practice.